we'll go ahead and start that recording. Feel free to keep your videos on or off as you feel most comfortable. But just wanted to say that I'm happy to have everyone here today. Really appreciate that you're taking the time out of your busy days to come and share your thoughts with us. I know that there's a lot. We're asking a lot of all of you to come and participate in these events and tell us what you think. But I also think it's a very exciting opportunity to be able to do some community design work to tell the decision makers, how you all think the future of Arcata, how it should look, feel, and be represented in architecture and streetscape and that sort of thing. My name is David Loya. I'm the Director of Community Development at the City of Arcata. I've had the pleasure of being able to work on this project since its inception. We've got a great team, both city staff as well as a consulting team that is helping us put this work together. Ben Noble, who's a partner on that consulting team, will be taking the lead on the presentations today, and so I'll turn it over to him in just a minute. He will go into a lot more detail about the types of materials that we'll be covering, the types of concepts that we'll be covering tonight. So I will just breeze over them and point out that tonight's meeting is an opportunity to tell us what you think about some concepts for what the streetscape should look like, the public area outside of buildings, what the mobility patterns, what the design of streets and parking should look like. We're also going to be looking at publicly accessible private open space, which is one of the requirements in the code. And so those are the general topics that we'll be covering tonight, and want to make sure that we're focusing our discussion on those topics. I did just want to mention, so that we can stay focused on the design elements of these things, that we've heard from several in the community, their concerns and concepts about how K&L Street should be treated. We recognize those comments, and the Planning Commission and the City Council are taking those comments into consideration. But our focus tonight is not on whether any particular street should be designated for any particular purpose, or whether these designs that we'll be looking at should be attributed to any particular street. Instead, we're really just trying to get a sense for your reflections on the design concepts that we'll be bringing forward. So if you do want to comment on that, obviously, we will hear those comments, but we'll also ask that we put those comments, on a list of items that we can discuss in the near future. So let's go ahead and, without further ado, get started. I will hand this over to Ben Noble and ask him to take it from here.
Great. Thank you, David. Okay, so we can see the title slide in all its glory.
Absolutely.
All right. Okay. Thank you, David, for that introduction. Again, my name is Ben Noble. I'm part of the consultant team working on the Gateway Area Plan and the Gateway Code. I'm happy to be here tonight for the second virtual workshop on the Gateway Code, which we're going to be talking about streetscape design, mobility and parking, and open space. So if you were at the first virtual workshop, this is similar format, but not 100% identical. We're going to begin with an overview of the workshop and where we are in the Gateway Code development process. And then we're going to focus on three topics, the three topics I mentioned before. And what we're going to do is, for each of those topics, I'm going to give about a 5 to 10 minute presentation. We're going to then break up into breakout rooms for some discussion of that material. Do that for about 20 minutes. For the first topic, which is streetscape design, and then come back with the full group for mobility. I'll give a presentation on that, and then we'll divide again into breakout rooms. And then for the last topic, privately open space, privately owned, publicly accessible open space will come back together again as a group and then break out again. So there'll be 3 separate breakout room discussion sessions, and then we'll conclude with a wrap up. And so we'll be finished no later than 8 o'clock tonight. Okay, and so this virtual workshop tonight is part of a larger Gateway Code development process where we're having a series of meetings on development code topics. So the first meeting series we finished now, and that was primarily on building design. And so we had a virtual workshop followed by an online survey and then a planning commission work session. We're now following the same process for the second set of topics, which is streetscape, mobility, parking, and open space. So after the virtual workshop tonight, there'll be an online survey where you'll have an opportunity to provide some additional comments on these materials, maybe after having taken the time to review them more and think about it a little bit more. You'll have an opportunity to provide additional comments through that online survey. And then there will be a Planning Commission work session on this material that will have further developed and refined for them to review and provide comments. And then there'll be a third series on some of the remaining important topics, including community benefits programs, the permits, and some other topics, with the goal of having a complete public review draft of the code ready for the Planning Commission to begin its review process in early June of 2023. So as David mentioned, we really thank you for taking the time to participate in this work. And just a reminder, we're looking at the Gateway area, which is the area that's subject to the Gateway Area Plan. It's west of downtown and north of Samoa Boulevard. It's 138 acres. And it's the area that contains the Creamery District, as well as existing industrial, commercial, and residential uses. There is a draft gateway plan that has been prepared. There is a revised draft that was published in October of 2022, and it's currently under review by city commissions. And this document is the policy foundation for the work that we're doing in the Gateway Code, which is the tool that we're going to use primarily to implement this plan. And as mentioned at prior events, the Gateway Code is going to contain form and character standards for different sub-areas within the Gateway area, as well as rules for allowed uses, standards that apply district area-wide, such as parking and historic resources. It's going to include standards for streetscape and public open spaces for the public realm. There'll be a section on the community benefits program, which allows increased height for projects that provide amenities that benefit the public. And then also permit requirements, including rules for projects that may be allowed through a streamlined ministerial process. So tonight we're looking at a subset of those topics, as I mentioned before, really focusing on streetscape design, mobility and parking standards, as well as privately owned, publicly accessible open space. So at the first workshop, we were very focused on the design of buildings on private property. Tonight, we're looking more at the public realm and what the standards are that shape that space within the Gateway area. So I'll start with streetscape design. And as I mentioned previously, I'll give about a 10-minute presentation on these materials, and then we'll divide into breakout rooms and have more of a discussion and hear your thoughts on these materials in those breakout rooms. So you may ask, well, what is streetscape? Streetscape is the term that we use to talk about the design of roadways, sidewalks, and building frontages that are facing the street, really the public realm that's defined by the area outside of buildings. And the draft gateway plan includes a number of policies specifically related to this subject. The plan calls for creating high quality streetscapes that are visually interesting and provide safe and comfortable places for people to walk and gather, and to provide for a streetscape design that visually unites the gateway area and promotes a cohesive sense of place. And so the Gateway Code will be implementing that larger vision. And at tonight's workshop, we're focusing on the design of the pedestrian realm in the streetscape. So as David mentioned, we're not focusing on roadway configurations and travel lanes within the space between curbs. We're really focused on the pedestrian realm between the curb and the building. And so this graphic illustrates that. And when we talk about the pedestrian realm, we think about 3 different zones within that space. So closest to the curb, there's the landscape amenity zone, which includes things like street trees, lighting, bike racks, benches, things like that, landscaping and amenities. And then there's the sidewalk or the pedestrian clear zone, which is the space where people are walking along the street within the pedestrian realm. And then there's the frontage setback zone. And adjacent to an active commercial use like this, a storefront, this zone might be used for outdoor dining, cafe seating, maybe some planters, maybe some benches, things like that. And so we're thinking about the design and the configuration of these 3 different zones within the pedestrian realm, which is really what we're focusing on tonight. Okay, so during tonight's workshop, we're going to be talking about some dimensions of the pedestrian realm. And just as a point of reference, here are a few images of sidewalks in Arcata today. So here is 8th Street fronting the plaza, and that has about a 4-foot sidewalk pedestrian clear, and then a 3-foot area that can accommodate landscaping, street trees, benches, and other similar amenities. Here's another image showing the frontage of the Plaza Point apartments. And for most of that frontage, there's about a 4-foot sidewalk pedestrian clear. It varies a little bit, but then about 3 feet for street trees, bike racks, and other similar street furniture. At the intersection, there's a bulb out that increases the width of the sidewalk to about 7 feet, with a space for benches, landscaping, and other street furniture of about 5 feet. So I'm showing this to give you a reference point for our discussion later. And so where we are with streetscape standards for the Gateway Code is we have an approach that we're planning to take that we want to share with you tonight before we embark on more specific design work to develop more detailed standards that we plan to share with the Planning Commission and with you and the general public in advance of the Planning Commission's work session. We want to share this approach with you, see what thoughts you have, and that will help us as we further develop and refine this material. So our recommended approach is really to plan for a generous pedestrian realm with wide sidewalks in the areas of the Gateway area plan where we're anticipating the highest amount of pedestrian activity. And we're also visioning that through the community benefits program and the baseline development standards, that allowing development to build up a little bit higher than what's currently allowed will permit the use of private property to create a high quality public realm. And what that means is that new sidewalks, in many cases, would need to project into private property um, and would be located there with a new street easement. And these new streetscape improvements would be required only when property is redeveloped. So also as part of this approach, we're anticipating that the Gateway Code will define street types or street typologies, and each of these street types will have unique streetscape standards. And the code will assign a specific street type to all existing and planned new streets. So this is what we're envisioning with the streetscape standards within the Gateway Code. And we wanted to share two examples of what this might look like with you to help illustrate it and get some feedback from you on this concept. So we have one street type that we're sharing with you tonight that we're calling the town center street. And this would be a street type intended for the highest activity areas within the Gateway area plan, places like 8th and 9th Street, really the core of the area. There's another street type that we put together that's intended for less active areas, places such as 11th and 12th Street, more around the periphery of the Gateway plan area. Okay, so here is a graphic that is illustrating the town center street. On the left is a section diagram, and on the right is a plan view diagram. And for those of you less familiar with section diagrams, what this is essentially, it's taking a slice perpendicular through the street and the sidewalk and the building of what it may look like. The plan view diagram is looking straight down from above. And so if we look at the section diagram in the left, you can see the pedestrian zone with the dimensions there. That's the space between the curb and the building. And what that's showing is a 5-foot landscape amenity zone for street trees, landscaping, benches, street lights, things like the bike racks, things like that. And then next to that is a 10-foot sidewalk. And then next to that is a 5-foot frontage zone next to an active frontage, a storefront. So we're thinking there's a term of art that we're using here, active frontage types. And really what that means is the ground floor of buildings that is designed for a lot of pedestrian activity, things like commercial storefronts, lobbies, and other building frontages that are typical for high traffic areas. That's what that means. And then if you look at the right, that's the plan view looking down from up above. It's the same dimensions as the section diagram, just from a different point of view. And you can see there for the pedestrian realm, the dimensions are shown. 5 feet for the landscaping amenity zone for street trees and bike racks and things like that. 10 feet for a sidewalk, and then 5 feet for a frontage zone in front of that storefront for outdoor dining, maybe benches, maybe some landscapes. So these are dimensions that are intended for the highest pedestrian activity areas within the Gateway plan area. And if you look at the section on the left, you can see there's some color there. And there's also a property line that's shown as well. And what we're envisioning here is that in order to maintain the existing 40-foot curb to curb roadway width, that the sidewalk would need to be located within private property with a street easement to provide for public access through that property. And then there would also be that 5-foot frontage zone. And so this is an important concept that we wanted to highlight at tonight's meeting, just to make sure that everybody understands that in order to utilize the roadway for multimodal transportation for cars and for bikes and for transit, as well as for on-street parking, as well as to provide this very generous pedestrian realm within these high activity areas. It's going to necessitate utilizing in places some of private property for the new sidewalk easement. And so there'll be an opportunity to talk more about this and get some of your questions answered during the breakout room session. Okay, so you may be asking, well, what does this look like in real life terms? Here's an example. Some of you may have been here. This is Pacific Avenue in Santa Cruz. They did a comprehensive reconfiguration of their streetscape after the Loma Prieta earthquake, and it varies from block to block. But here's an example of a block where you have about a 20-foot distance from the curb to the building wall, which is about the distance that we're thinking for the most pedestrian active areas within the gateway plan, what kind of distance that we would hope to achieve where we can. And as part of our further design work, as we work on this, sort of after we've received comments tonight and through the online survey, we're going to be looking at this on a block by block basis in specific parcels as well, in order to understand really the locations where this would be most appropriate and where it's feasible, given unique site constraints and existing conditions. So another part of this concept is that for non-active street frontages, non-active frontage building types such as stoops and porches that are accessing residential units, the frontage zone or the setback would be a little bit more than for the active frontage types to provide for more privacy for those ground floor residential office uses and provide for more of a transition from the public realm and the sidewalk to the private property. So different frontage zone standards for non-active frontages compared to active frontages is a part of the concept as well. Okay, and so I was just talking about pedestrian realm dimension standards for what we're calling a town center frontage. We're also envisioning other street types that might be for areas where we're expecting less pedestrian activity. In those cases, the dimensions may be a little bit more constrained with narrow sidewalks, maybe a narrower landscape amenity zone as well. Here's an example of what we're calling a neighborhood street. You can see the section diagram on the left that is showing a 7-foot sidewalk as opposed to a 10-foot sidewalk in the town center street type. And again, if there is a non-active frontage with, say, a ground floor residential use with a porch or a patio, there would be an increased setback, an increased frontage zone to provide for more privacy for those ground floor uses, as well as more of a transition from that public to the private realm. So that's part of the concept as well. So that's an overview of our recommended approach for the streetscape design. And as I mentioned previously, we're at a point where we wanted to share some of these concepts with you at this virtual workshop before we proceeded with some more detailed design work to take to the Planning Commission. We're asking for some of your feedback and reactions tonight as part of this virtual workshop. There will also be an online survey where you can take a little bit more time to look at some of these materials and provide additional comments. But what we're looking for tonight are reactions to questions such as these. What's your general reaction to the material, the ideas that I just presented? Do you have any comments about the specific standards of any of these two street typologies that I shared? For example, for the town center street, the 10-foot sidewalk, the 5-foot amenity zone. Do you have any specific reactions to that? Any reactions to the idea of varied frontage zones or setbacks for active versus non-active use, as well as anything else that you might want to share related to the streetscape design, particularly of the pedestrian realm. So as I said previously, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions and provide comments in your breakout rooms. And so that's what we'll do now. You're going to be randomly assigned to a room. In the room, there'll be a facilitator who will share materials, will manage discussion, and will be there to answer questions. And we'll have about 20 minutes for that discussion.
Someone had to try and speak while they were muted. I guess that was going to be me. Welcome all. I'm going to go ahead and start the PowerPoint here, and we'll kick off a hopefully lively discussion about this material. Okay, so I think we are a small enough group so that we can, just kind of popcorn it. If it starts to get to the point where we're talking over one another and, having a hard time, getting, sharing the space, then maybe we'll move over to, raising hands or some way indicating that you wish to speak, and we'll put people in line that way. I would encourage you, if you feel comfortable, to go ahead and turn your video on. This segment is intended to be a little more interactive, and if we can see one another, that'll go a long ways towards helping us to communicate more effectively together. Again, my name is David Loya. I'm the Director of Community Development, and looks like we're all indicated by name. So I think we're gonna kind of skip the formal introduction so we can save more time for discussion, if that's okay with everyone here. Okay, great. So Ben just presented the material. I have the same material if we want to go into detail on specific images that he shared. And so the idea is really just to get a general sense for your reactions to these materials, and we can, kind of ping pong around. We don't have to go in the order that they were presented. So just in general, does someone want to start off with your reaction to the recommended streetscape design approach? Go ahead and unmute and jump in.
Oh, sorry, just about then the phone goes off. I apologize. I'm going to jump out for a second.
Okay.
Scott had his hand up, I believe.
Oh, go ahead. Okay. There you go.
Question?
Yeah, did you have? Yeah, please.
And we own 4 studio apartments on 464 H Street in the alley behind Arcadia Used Tires. And I was just curious, looking at this, what changes were going to be made, but it looks like most of the streetscape design standards are for new construction. Is that about right?
That's a very accurate statement, and the streetscapes for internal neighborhoods that aren't anticipated to have high traffic will probably look a lot like your existing street does now. If there was significant redevelopment on your street, we would probably try and get a little bit more close to the standard that we have.
One more question.
That's a great question.
One more question. Have you already, or are you going to address the street changes? Or is there going to be some one-way changes in this plan, or is that just something different?
Yeah, so we're not really going into that in detail tonight, but the plan does have a proposal for making 8th and 9th a one-way loop. And then currently there's a proposal to have K and L Street each become one-way couplet. so that you'd be able to go northbound on K Street and southbound on L Street. The 8th and 9th Street is a change that we can make in the relative near future. We have complete control over all of the rights of way associated with that. The change to a one-way couplet on K and L Street is probably a decade or more in the making.
Sure.
We don't have all of the right of way necessary, and that's a very expensive project if we did. In addition, that is just what's in the current draft proposal. There are several people in the community who have said that they don't like that concept, that they'd rather see something else happen. So the council is really going to have to balance the priorities when it comes to redesigning these streets.
Sure. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any thoughts, general reactions to the streetscape design approach? Let me see if we can kind of walk through, and this might stimulate some thinking. In general, all of them are designed with this overall approach where there's an amenity zone, a sidewalk that's going to be free and clear to make sure that there's access. Right now, many of the sidewalks in Arcata, you have to walk around, power poles or, other things that are embedded in the sidewalk. So we'd be talking about a clear path sidewalk, and then some kind of frontage setback that's used for different purposes depending on the street type it is. It's in a heavy traffic area where you expect to see a lot of pedestrian foot traffic, then that frontage setback would be used for, for business purposes, little, dining or, landscaping, things like that. If it was more designed for a neighborhood look, then that would be used for, for something that was more on the private side, landscaping, a front yard of sorts. Jim, I think you wanted to speak earlier and you got distracted by the phone. Did you want to jump in and talk about your general?
And honestly, it's just I have nothing but positive things to say. I think the idea of allowing more space will, and it sounds like it's working into the new construction, so it affords that. I think it's a good idea. It just in general, I would just say, allowing room for possibly the businesses and with tables, access to restaurants or whatever it might be, and enough space to get by it. It looks great.
Okay, great. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Sherry?
Hey, David. Oh, I'll raise my hand.
Sorry, I had my hand up. And just to clarify, this is going into a bucket of optional amenities that a developer may elect to give the city, or is it going to be a requirement?
Yeah, that's a great question. For those of you who are new to the conversation, the way that the code is being structured, or the way it's envisioned to be structured at this point, I should say, is that there are going to be some code standards that are required that buildings must conform to. And if they don't, then they would have to go through a more lengthy planning process to try and ask for exceptions to those codes. And then in addition to that, there is a group of community benefits that are optional, and projects, depending on how dense they are, would have to select from amongst these optional categories. They will all give something, but they're optional what they give. And so, Sherry, your question is what we're discussing tonight with Streetscape, is that optional or not? And the answer is no. These will be standards that the new developments would need to conform to. And there's a couple of different ways that they could be financed, but new development would come into compliance with these new standards.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Raylina?
Thanks. I'm curious to know, both the residential and the commercial setbacks look really good. I'm curious to know, within like a potential larger development, for instance, are there stipulations around how if there's multiple buildings in a residential development, for example, are there stipulations for those kinds of setbacks? So sort of an in-between from private use and public use, since we're, for instance, apartment buildings.
Mm-hmm. Let me see if I make sure I'm understanding the question correctly. So in different development types, could these standards be flexible based on the type of development it is?
Yeah, more so applying the same standards, similar, the same residential standards, for instance, where it's or you know whatever is appropriate, but applying those standards in between buildings within the same development, for
Oh,
instance.
I understand what you're saying. Setbacks within interior to the development.
Exactly.
At this point, we're not contemplating that. I would say that, and in particular, tonight's focus is really on the streetscape,
Sure.
and so the internal design, is largely left to those designers to build those. We may ultimately have some standards in the building designs that have requirements for access to to glazing, for example, access to windows. But right now, there's no specific design standard for that.
Okay, that would, I guess, be my only recommendation is, rather than exempting, or just request, I guess, or feedback would be rather than exempting buildings that are on a single parcel but contain multiple buildings, applying the same private setback, code to those buildings as if it were different parcels.
Okay. Looks like we're using hands. So Patricia, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just have a question so if a new development is going in an area and it's within a block that has existing like an existing lot, or a lot that's using has a different usage and not developing something new, how are you going to incorporate the new sidewalk width with what is already existing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think let me again reiterate and make sure I'm understanding the question correctly, is that you may have a block that has multiple parcels and not all of them are going to develop at the same time. And so, how are we going to see these blocks built out? Did I get that correct?
Yeah, that's how are you going to have do a sidewalk that is actually all encompassing for a whole block? How are you going to incorporate the different type? Yeah, so exactly.
Right. So yeah, it does get a lot more complicated when when you have multiple parcels and they develop at different rates. In general, again, I want to make sure we're focused on design and that we're hitting the right design elements here. And so don't want to get too sidetracked on this concept, but there are different ways that it can be approached. One would be to create an impact fee for blocks like that, where when a developer comes in, they build their building to meet that setback standard. They build, if we're looking at the one that we have up on the screen right now, they build their frontage zone so that it's compliant. But it could be that the sidewalk portion, in this instance, it's shown on the inside of the property line. And so this sidewalk portion would be, run up against the two adjacent properties, let's say, and into their front yards. And so that portion of street isn't as useful. That portion of the sidewalk isn't as useful that way. And so there'd have to be an interim, where perhaps the sidewalk is initially expanded or addressed on this portion, or it could be with the impact fee that we come in and do an entire block at one time. So it's really going to be dependent on what's going on that particular block and the instances or the circumstances of that particular block. There are several blocks like the that are owned entirely by one entity, and so those would be easy. They would just do the block when they develop. that make sense?
Yes, yes, thank you.
Go. Okay, go ahead, Cindy.
Just kind of a practical note. When the 8th and 9th streets were being talked about on which side of the street to put, on which side of the entranceway put the street on, and then also putting in the frontage and sidewalk area, I would just suggest that put the frontage area that people would want to sit where they put the chairs and stuff on the north side of 8th and 9th, because you're going to get a better chance of being in the sun than if we're parked up against some of the buildings that are built up on 8th Street. If we're tucked underneath the building, it can be really cold. It's just not that enticing to sit in the shade. Because I know when I walk the streets a lot. I'm always crossing over to find the sunshine. So if there's a choice of which side of the street to have the road and which side the access road, and then also where chairs and stuff would be. And then also with the trees, I worked on a lot of environmental projects, and after the fact of, hey, we need to take care of the trees, or there needs to be weeding or whatever, that always seems to be dropped at the end of the project. We plant the trees, and there's a lot of issues of leaves plugging up the storm drains right now. There just isn't enough street sweeping, and I've seen that go down. I just see them plugged up all the time, and if there can be a real concentrated effort making sure that there's maintenance fees that are going to be extracted early on, and not
Cindy, I'm sorry. The rest of the group one has already gone back in for the rest of the presentation. So David, if you want to wrap it up really quick, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Sorry about
thanks,
that.
Jen. No, it's fine. We're trying to keep on a tight ship here. Ron, can we hear from you, and then we'll go back into the main room.
I just wanted to say I really like the design. I especially the frontage right in front of apartments that have, ability to have shrubs and things like that. So I'm all for it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we'll see you back in the main room.
Okay, all right. So you have had the misfortune of being assigned into my breakout room, which is an opportunity for us to talk about the material that I just presented. And we're going to have about 15 minutes to do this. And as I mentioned in my presentation, we're sharing these thoughts with you with some sort of initial recommendations for how we're going to approach this in order to get this out in the public realm and see if you have any reactions to it, with the understanding that you'll have an opportunity to provide additional comments through the online survey, as well as the opportunity to review and comment on more detailed design work that's going to be coming up with the Planning Commission work session next month and other future meetings on the draft code itself. So I think what I want to do, I have all of the materials that I shared in the presentation that I can pull up on the screen if you want to look at them. But I think what I want to do is just sort of open this up to everybody who we have here in this group, and just see what your reaction is, your reaction to what I just shared in terms of the recommended streetscape design approach, the standards that you saw for those example street types, and then any other thoughts that you have. I'm very curious and interested in your reactions to what you just saw. Does anyone want to jump?
I don't mind starting. Sure.
Okay.
Hi,
Maria.
my name's Maria, and first and foremost, I think it all looks really exciting, and I am present tonight because we just purchased a lot just about 2 blocks west of the most western edge of the whole project on 11th Street. So I anticipate this is going to be a project that we're literally driving through to get to our residence that is yet to be built. So cruising on 11th Street, you know, off of, you know, whatever, K. My question is, I think you said relative to the active frontage zone that there was going to be some need to use up some private property to make that happen. So my first question is, did I hear that accurately?
Yes.
Okay, great. And then my second question is, what does that look like? Could you give an example of using private property to make that active frontage area?
So the private property would be for the sidewalk. So right now you have in most places you have a little 5-foot sidewalk that's between the curb and the property line, which could be a building or it could be a front yard. That's not a lot of space. That's not a lot of space to create a active, welcoming public pedestrian realm, which is what we're looking for. So I think what the vision is for that area that's now the little 5-foot sidewalk is that there could be sort of this landscaping street tree area. And then next to that, there would be a sidewalk that would vary in width from place to place, but you know, it could be 5 feet, it could be as long as 10 feet or wide as 10 feet. And that would need to project over the property line into private property with a street easement established there. And when there's an existing street network with narrow sidewalks and there's a desire to transform the area into a more pedestrian-oriented area with wider sidewalks, that's typically the strategy that's used. And sometimes there's a lot of fear and trepidation about this idea of using private property for that purpose. You know, I think usually property owners come around to the idea because they understand that there's sort of there's an opportunity for more intensive development that's being allowed, and that would sort of offset the need to use a portion of that street frontage for a wider sidewalk. So that's the concept. That's the concept. Okay, and I see David, given limited time, I'll maybe move on to David.
So first of all, I think, you know, we know what the questions are. So could you let us see each other rather than look at
sure.
questions?
Yeah. I certainly could do that.
Thank you. So the comment that I have, I mean, obviously that street design is attractive. And I've been, you know, the place that you showed in Santa Cruz, and clearly it invites a whole range of uses that the sidewalk alone doesn't invite or allow. And obviously it would be nice to have many more places outdoors in Arcata that would invite outdoor uses for, you know, for all kinds of different scores and even people's homes. The question though, I mean, the devil's in the details. So you're asking people for 15 feet, basically, in either example. And the question is, what do they get for it? So it's really hard to evaluate the goodies without knowing, you know, the whole system of what it is that the city will give them, because 15 feet is a lot. You know, it's a lot of, it's a significant portion of their lot. And so that's why, as I say, I mean, I think the design would be great, but if people were getting something that would counteract the value of the design, you know, so that's why it's hard to give you, you know, if we're just looking at, is the design attractive? Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, no, your point is well taken. And I think we're using tonight's meeting to just sort of take a few minutes to introduce the concept with a lot of the details sort of being worked out and with opportunity for further sort of consideration of those details. And so I see Jane is patiently waiting with her hand raised.
Yes.
Thank you, David. for this
Two things. I like the varied concepts myself. I think they're great. I think the devil again is in the details of how you negotiate to get an additional 10 to 15 feet. And I think merely the option of having an amenity for a builder that they can build another story or higher or whatever have you, is not going to work with people such as, what was her name? I'm sorry, Maria, who have bought a piece of property, and I don't know what your length of your lot is, your depth of your lot is, and I don't know if they'd be eating up some huge proportion. I think our existing requirements are that you have to provide a 5-foot sidewalk, right? Is that correct?
That seems to be the standard throughout the city.
So if you're going to build right now, they require you to have a 5. Why don't they just change the requirement that if you build, now you have to provide a 10-foot sidewalk? The other thing, I mean, I think that would be quite easy for new properties, okay? But you ought to check into that. I don't know. The other option is giving a rebate on taxes to that property owner so that it would be worth their while to do that. And in looking at these streetscapes, I'm wondering how a fire truck is going to gain access to the building when they're potentially 20 feet away from the roadway. Or are you anticipating they're going to be able to drive on a 10-foot sidewalk when there's a fire? So I think that needs to be taken into consideration. If you've got trees between, and all these nice tall plantings between the curb and the building, you need to figure out a way to address that and either space the trees so that a fire truck can get in there in between. That takes logistical planning.
Okay.
So
thanks, Jane. So we only have a couple more minutes. And
I'll stop. Thank
so
you.
I think Lizzie has her hand up, and then if you could sort of quickly make your comments, and then we can pass it on to Anthony.
I think, was Anthony first?
Or
I guess
Anthony, if you were first, that's generous of you, Lizzie.
Either way, it's good with me. Mine is pretty quick, so maybe it works better this way. I want to thank you for your hard work and all the people who have commented, and just because it helps me feel comfortable saying that, you know, forgive me if you brought this up when you were talking, but as you were speaking, I'm thinking he hasn't mentioned anything about how dark it is on those streets. And I'm curious about when there's going to be proper lighting for the amount of people and the traffic that's there now. And also, I think that a lot of this is really big transitions that are happening fairly quickly. And I think that it's a hard sell to the public that owns property there to ask them to relinquish some of their lots so that the buildings can be built, when a lot of the people in the public either don't know or aren't supportive of giant buildings anyway. So it's kind of like, to me, I feel like it's good to move slow and do things proper, and it looks like a good design, but it's going to take a lot to make the changes, and so I want to see them done responsibly and with respect.
Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you.
Lizzie.
Hi. I'm very supportive of wider sidewalks personally. I have some friends that have disability, and it's really challenging to navigate such kind of rough terrain, narrow sidewalk, really close to traffic. I live off of Alliance, and I like the Alliance and Foster corner where there's just a 5-foot sidewalk is so scary and makes me think of the girl who died a few weeks ago. I think that having pedestrian safety be the top priority in design, especially when we're trying to transition away from relying on cars and doing more biking and more, one wheel travel and more walking, I think is really a responsible move to really prioritize pedestrian safety, because I'm scared, honestly, walking my dog in kind of the really claustrophobic spaces that we have right now. So yeah, I totally understand, property owners feeling kind of, but I feel like it would help us all to have like safer spaces. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks. All right, and so we're at 6:40, which is the time that we need to go back into the full group for a brief presentation on parking and mobility.
Ben,
So,
are you?
But I
you guys-
didn't see a space for bike paths either, by the way, unless that was meant to be on the pedestrian way.
yeah, so I think that would be something that would be accommodated within the curb to curb space. So that was
Yeah, it just wasn't there, so I didn't know.
okay.
Ben,
Thanks,
just
Jane.
checking in with
Yep,
you to see you guys
we're-
are about
we're
ready to
ready.
wrap up. Okay.
We're ready to head back. Thank you.
All right.
I think we're all here, Ben.
Great. Okay, so we'll now continue with our second topic, which is mobility and parking. So there's a chapter within the draft gateway plan that establishes goals and policies related to mobility and parking. And the policies that are most relevant to the gateway code really focus on allowing for and encouraging a car-free lifestyle, incentivizing active transportation like biking and walking, and alternative transportation such as transit. There are policies about disconnecting parking minimums from land use, as is the case today. There are policies related to the design and location of parking, particularly about the placement of parking on a lot, and also policies about implementing strategies that aim to minimize vehicle trips for many different purposes, including reducing the community's climate footprint. And so the Gateway Code will implement these gateway plan policies in a number of different ways. And I'm going to go through some of the draft standards that we are proposing related to mobility and parking. And then you'll have the opportunity to provide further comments within your breakout room, as well as through the online survey, which will be available after tonight's meeting. So the first topic has to do with the number of spaces. And the Gateway Plan includes a policy to disconnect required on-site parking from land use. So currently there's often a requirement that for a dwelling unit on a site, there needs to be 1 or maybe 1.5 or 2 parking spaces per dwelling unit. What we are proposing for the Gateway Code is that for residential uses, there is no minimum on-site parking, and that for neighborhood serving commercial uses such as retail and residence, there also is no minimum on-site parking. So what that would mean is that if somebody were to build a mixed-use project with housing above ground floor residential, like Plaza Point, for example, that there would be no requirement for on-site parking. They could build the project with no parking on-site. What we are also proposing is maximum parking on the site. And so the reason we're doing that is we really want to use the limited land that's available within the city to maximize housing production. And in order to do that, we need to minimize car storage on site. And so we're proposing rules for maximum parking for residential uses, and that might vary from district to district, as well as maximum parking for commercial, employment, and hotel uses. So there'll be no minimum parking for most land uses, and then there'll also be maximum parking requirements. So that's a departure from the parking rules in many places in Arcata now, and we're interested in your feedback on that. So we also have standards related to transportation demand management, also known as TDM. And what TDM is measures that cities adopt and implement that reduce vehicle trips and promote transportation alternatives. So an example of a TDM measure might be free transit passes. It might be bicycle commuter amenities. So in an office, showers and lockers, for example. And it also might be separating the cost of parking for a resident from the rental agreement so that the resident has the option to spend money on a parking space or not. Those are all examples of TDM measures. And so what we're proposing in our standards is that for employment uses over 10,000 square feet, which may generate parking demand for employees, that they must prepare a TDM plan with specific measures to reduce parking demand and encourage alternative transportation. And then what we're also proposing is that for a residential project, could include TDM measures as a community benefit. So for example, a residential project could offer free transit passes, and that's something that would qualify as a community benefit that would allow for additional height under the community benefit program, along with other community benefits that the project is providing. Okay, so a specific type of TDM measure, as I mentioned, is unbundled parking. And what unbundled parking is separating the cost of parking from the rent, lease, or sale of housing or commercial space by creating a separate parking charge, as I mentioned before. And what we are proposing for the Gateway area is to require any provided on-site parking that's serving commercial tenants or residences to be unbundled from the cost of lease space, rent, or purchase. So remember, we're not requiring any on-site parking, but if a developer chose to provide on-site parking, that parking, the cost of that parking would have to be unbundled from the cost of the rental agreement or the purchase price. Okay, so we're also proposing standards for carpools and car sharing. So if there's a large employment use that is established within the Gateway area that has more than 40,000 square feet, they would need to provide at least one carpool van pool space. If there is a residential project that is more than 50 units or more, they would need to provide at least one car share space if there's a car share service operating in an Arcata. And similarly, if there's a large employment use, that use would also need to provide at least one car share space if there's a car share service provider operating in Arcata. So there'll also be standards for parking location and design. I'll talk about a couple of those. So ideally, if there's on-site parking as well as service access to a use, that would be from an alley. We understand there's not a lot of existing alleys in the Gateway area. We may plan for more alleys. And if there's an existing alley or one that's planned, that access to the parking would have to be from that alley. There are also rules about limiting the frequency of curb cuts, as well as minimizing the width of curb cuts. And this is all to create as safe and as welcoming an environment for pedestrians as possible. Okay, a very important part of the parking location and design standards has to do with the location of parking on the site. In fact, there's a policy in the Gateway plan that's specifically about that. And so what we're proposing in all areas of the Gateway area is that parking would not be permitted between a building and both the front main street and a side street, similar to what is shown in this graphic here. And then for surface parking lots that are visible from a side street, let's say, for example, there's a surface parking lot behind this building in this graphic that you could see from the street, there would need to be screening of at least 3 feet hedge fence or wall for that parking lot that's visible from the street. Okay, and the last set of standards that we're going to ask you to provide some feedback on tonight has to do with bicycle facilities. And so there will be requirements for bicycle parking for residential uses as well as non-residential uses. These proposed standards are similar to what's required elsewhere in the city right now. There also would be the opportunity to provide additional bicycle facilities. Let's say, for example, commuter amenities such as a shower and a locker from employees that would be part of the community benefits program. So I realize that's a lot of information. You'll have an opportunity to look at this more in your breakout group. And so we're asking if you have any specific recommended revisions to this material that you saw tonight, anything else that you want to share about parking and mobility, with the understanding that there'll be an opportunity for you to look at this more and provide further comments as part of the online survey. So with that, Jen will divide us again into our breakout rooms.
All right, welcome all. We, I think, got mixed a bit. It's good to mix it up. For those who were not in my room before and who maybe joined late, my name is David Loy. I'm the Director of Community Development with the City of Arcata. And I will be facilitating our breakout discussion. If you feel comfortable, please turn on your video. That'll make our conversation a little bit more personable, a little bit easier to track. If you don't, that's fine too. In our last breakout room, we kind of ran out of time. So what I'm going to ask is for folks, go ahead and raise your hand if you have some comments. And let's try and do, kind of debate style. So I'm going to give you 45 seconds to make your point, ask a question, that sort of thing. And we'll make sure that everybody gets an opportunity, and then we can go back and for another round and have a little bit more substantive discussion. So you can start anywhere you want on this. Looks like hands are up already. So Anthony, why don't you go ahead and start?
Thank you, David. My point is short. I respect the interest in making it more of a pedestrian town. I think it always has been. And I just see an issue with some of the, he mentioned that renters could potentially pay to park. And I just wonder how the city is gonna maintain, I know you guys want a lot of people to move here. So how do we give them a reason to move here without forcing them to pay for parking and making little annoying things like that happen that makes people not want to live here? And that's just my point about that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Relina?
Are there any stipulations about electric charging stations within parking? That's kind of an issue when you are driving an electric vehicle. One, if someone who isn't using an electric charger station is parked in an electric charging parking spot, but just, I don't know if that's too into the details, but that was my question and a suggestion to have at least some number of electric charging stations for vehicles in any parking scenario.
Yeah, so electric chargers are required by building code based on the number of parking spaces there are. And one of the options under the community benefits program would absolutely be to encourage additional, electrification. Lizzie?
Hi, I just wanted to express support and appreciation for the idea of reducing parking in order to increase pedestrian and bike use and public transit. I think that's excellent. And yeah, I don't really have a problem with any of that. I would love to live in a part of town that focused on those things.
Okay, thank you. Jim?
Thanks, David. Just a couple questions about well, one in particular, do you plan to anticipate the parking demand will probably come about for people who can afford to have their cars? Are you thinking it's probably just going to be a completely paid separate garage, or do you think that'll probably be within the units of where people are living? The second thing is do you actually anticipate if you uncouple parking from units, with the intent would be to save people costs in their rents, but my only concern is that it'll just be value added on top, and so hopefully this can translate into more reasonable price housing for people, and not simply the people who aren't paying just are not paying more. I mean, yeah, and that would be my question.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, that is a big concern. I've already had some interest expressed by existing developers for this idea of being able to charge for parking. And so I think we need to be careful about how we do that to make sure that it does translate into savings on rent. The other question that you asked, I think that where unbundling is applied, it would apply within the on-site parking for those facilities. There are some other ideas about having paid parking or metered parking outside the facilities on the public streets as well.
Okay.
Jane, I don't know if you came in on at the same time, but we're hoping to get folks to do a 45-second intro so we can get through everybody at least once, and then we can come back through and have more substantive discussion.
Okay, my question has to do with people who are trying to access commercial facilities and businesses within the area if there is no on-street parking, even if it's paid or unpaid. If you're trying to facilitate people coming in from the burbs, basically, and not just have people attending, going to those businesses that are in the area, I think you need to make accommodation for that. And it's not clear what that is.
Yeah, we can look at for commercial uses, they're allowed to put some parking in here. These parking standards can change based on, public input and decision makers' appetite for being very aggressive. These standards are very aggressive towards alternative transportation. Recognizing that, the changes are going to be slow and take place over the next several decades. And then also that, during that same time frame, we'll be increasing our, ability to have more shared parking and alternative transportation scenarios, better busing and that sort of thing. But it is a concern.
Yeah, I think you also
Sherry?
need to provide parking garages somewhere.
Yeah, that is on the docket to discuss as well. Sherry?
Jane said basically what my concerns were also, but I was hoping that you could put up the slide again that had an example of a block and where parking would not be allowed. So surface parking spaces may not be located in the area between the front and side property line. That concerns me a little bit because we have so few parking spaces going into the gateway area, that this additional restriction might just make things so hard to, if you have a car, you might end up driving around and round and round in circles around several blocks looking for a space that's available, and that obviously burns some fossil fuels in that search for a space.
Okay, thank you for that. And just to clarify, this is saying that when you have on-site parking that is exposed, so this white area back here, for example, would be allowed to have parking. You couldn't put the parking on the frontage. Part of the reason for that is that the plan is trying to make the frontages more pedestrian oriented. But yeah, that's a good comment. We have to balance the benefits of reducing parking and pushing towards alternative transportation with the fact that everyone's not going to walk away from their cars overnight. Una?
Thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks. Let's see. I definitely like the no minimums. I think that's almost a requirement to get the ball rolling. maximums definitely for consideration. And I think the unbundling is also a really good idea to see how that would shape out, because yeah, it just makes apparent what we pay for now that's not apparent. That's all I have.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. We were pretty efficient. I think we've got a little bit more time here. We've got until I'm sorry, 7:20. So we've still got quite a bit of time. If folks want to come back and have more comments, you can comment, about something that you heard from someone else that you'd like to respond back to, or we can talk about other, details that we have here. Una, did you have your hand up again, or did you? I'd not put it down yet. Okay. Jane, did you put your hand up again?
I did. So
All right, you're up.
it's hard to get a good concept of how many square feet a typical building will have in order to identify how many bicycle spaces or parking spaces will be required. And if we don't have alleyways, are you going to create alleyways in order to access parking? I just have a bunch of questions like that. It's very hard to conceptualize, what size building for X number of parking places, depending on what it is. And so I think it would be very helpful to have sample buildings with here's where the parking spaces aren't, here's where they would be, here's how you access them, and given X size building with X number of square feet, here's how many parking spaces you'd end up with. It's very hard to conceptualize.
Right. Yeah, so I think
just from words and square footages.
Yeah, absolutely. I hear you loud and clear. It is kind of hard to make that jump. And I think that, we'll be able to evaluate, some of these details in more specific site-specific examples. I think the idea right now is really to, from a general sense, are we on the right track, trying to require, higher proportions of bicycle facilities for for these developments. And some of these, you have to apply a standard, and it may not make sense in all examples. Wendy, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I did. With regard to EV charging, there's a lot of folks fought hard to have there be more EV charging and for every unit for multifamily housing. And we didn't succeed, but I think it was really, to me, it was really important for equity reasons. And I think that should not be having a charger, at least one per unit, should not be community benefit. I mean, we're talking, it's a lot more expensive to do the wiring after the fact than it is to put it in to begin with. So at least there should be an EV ready space for every parking space that should be, I guess, because if you're not even having one per unit, every parking space should be EV ready. I mean, we're thinking about these buildings are going to be built in the future. They're going to be there for many, many years. And that's going to be needed.
Okay. Yeah, I was just trying to find the standard you were talking about. I think maybe you're referring to both EV charging and the minimum parking spaces required. Raylina?
No, I was talking about the EV. I was talking about that there needs to be more, that having extra EV charging shouldn't be community benefit. It needs to be required that every parking space, because eventually they're all going to be EVs. Yeah.
I got you.
Well said.
I agree with that, by the way.
I wonder
Hey,
too
Raylina?
if I was going to chime in about whether or not it's possible to set a maximum on parking permit prices. you know, just so that we don't see something running rampant, where, you know, you're paying rent and then you're also paying another rent, for a parking space.
Yeah, there are a lot of equity issues that we have to think through on those, and you know, ensure that there's not disproportionate impacts on, you know, lower income people, people of color, you know, people who don't have the luxury of being able to not rely on a car. So I think those are really good points. Sherry?
I think with the problem of bike theft, that if we really want to encourage people to ride, that indoor and secured bike storage needs to be a requirement and not an optional amenity.
I agree.
Okay. Yeah, I think the idea is to have some minimums for you know, secure storage of bicycles. Where I think where the community benefit comes in is when you start providing for much more robust infrastructure for bike commuting, or you know, other ways of getting to work, you know, such as locker rooms and showers and that sort of thing. But we'll double check on that. Anthony? Looks like we have 1 minute. I'm
Hello.
getting a notice.
Thank you. Basic point that I want to make is that it seems like it's hard to conceive how many people Arcata is trying to attract. And I think that it's important to consider the charm that Arcata currently has, because if we race to build this place up to look like other cities, other people aren't going to want to come here. And I think a good way to put that is that a lot of us moved here because we didn't want to live in the cities. And that's just something that I think is worth keeping in mind, is almost like slow down and do things in a responsible way, not look for the pie in the sky and then fail because we, you know, built everything to be as maximum as much as we wanted to ideally make it. And then people don't want to live here because it's uncomfortable. It's just something I hope that we're keeping in mind.
We have about 35 seconds. Jane, I'm going to check in if there's anybody who hasn't spoken yet that would like to chime in before we close. Okay, seeing none. Jane, you have the floor.
It occurs to me that there may be any number of people who are interested in using little vehicles like golf cart kinds of things, transport, motorized motorized wheelchairs, but things like the little parking meter.
Okay, so welcome to my breakout room. Some of you I've seen before, some of you are new. And, you know, in the 15 or 20 minutes that we have for this, interested in your reactions to the things that you saw. Give it, you know, with the amount of time that we have, we don't have, you know, that much opportunity to delve in the details. But I wanted to start with what I showed you about the number of spaces, with there being no minimum for residential and neighborhood serving commercial uses, as well as maximum parking standards, and just to see what your reaction to that is. So Fred, I see that your hand is up. Why don't you go first?
Yes, thank you, Ben. How are you?
Good, thank you.
What we've heard from developers is that they want parking for their units. This came up with a proposed project. It was the Westwood Garden Apartments. He would not build unless there is one parking space per unit. And so we may be creating a situation here where you have 1/4 parking space per unit, where the developers are just not going to build. And the reason for this is because they get too much flack, or they can't rent the spaces. I also encourage you and everyone to not use the word unit, but rather bedrooms. For instance, where you have bicycles of 1 per unit, should be 1 per bedroom. Okay. But we're talking now about the maximum car spaces. Other things where you have things tied to an employer who has 40,000 square feet or 10,000 square feet. We don't have big employers. It might be more feasible to tie it to the building. if there's 40,000 square feet of space, then it needs, you had one carpool van space. I would suggest 3 or 4 or 5 carpool van spaces, or it might increase over the years as carpool become more prevalent. Also, you mentioned curb cuts as 1 per 250 feet. Is that on a per parcel basis or a per block basis? If we have, some of our parcels, of course, are entire block, others are small parcels. But the main thing, as I said, is that the developers are not going to be interested in a quarter car per unit or a quarter car per bedroom situation. And based on their feelings, which may be right or wrong, that they won't be rentable. That's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Fred. Okay, who is next? Patricia, you're next on my screen. And Cindy will make sure to get to you.
Yes, hello.
Hello.
I was just wondering, how do you accommodate for ADA concerns without having parking off-site, or or on-site? Do you make sure that there's a certain number, like on street side, off-site parking? So that was just a curiosity.
Yeah, that is a great point, and we will add it to the list of things that we will think more about. Thank you for that. Okay, Cindy.
Hi. I understand, your concept of doing this, which sounds great, except I live a block and a half away from the planned gateway project, and it is a little dismaying to think that there could be a large increase of people that would be parking, in our neighborhoods and leaving their cars there for times. And is there some, do you have any protections for the residential areas that live nearby and are concerned that maybe we'd be having to park 2-3 blocks away as people who have stashed their cars on the residential roads around the Gateway project? Is there any talk about that and the concerns? Because we are in a pretty isolated area, and a lot of people are going to drive up here just to have a car to drive back home again. It's really hard. I use the public transportation, Greyhound and all that. It can be pretty difficult to get, most people will rely on cars. And so that's a concern. Is there talk on how to protect the existing residents and increase their support? Because I love to support Gateway, but it is a dismaying to think that I could have, a hard time just being able to get into my, be able to park near my home.
Yeah. So my opinion is that the plan and the code needs to do more to address that concern. And I think that when this goes to the Planning Commission for further discussion, that that issue will be called out for further consideration, particularly, how to better protect neighboring areas from increased on-site parking that may occur as a result of establishing new parking maximums. So I don't think I'm prepared to speak specifically to what those might be tonight, but I want to tell you that I hear you, and I think that it's important.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's see. Chris, I think you're next. Chris, if you want to share anything.
Can you hear me now? Okay, sorry.
Yes.
It's been a while since I've done this. I'm been quite busy doing other things, but
good for you.
Well, I'm trying to eat dinner at the same time while I'm doing this. I grilled up some food and but anyway, it's very interesting what's going on with all this. I just had a comment on this aspect. It's looking like there's a big promotion to do combination buildings that have commercial on the bottom, residential up above, and I don't see anywhere on this chart that shows how the parking would work out in a scenario like that. What would you recommend or suggest with that?
Yeah, so it would be combined for the individual uses. So let's say you had a mixed use project with 30 units in the Barrel District, and let's say this was the rule that was ultimately adopted. They could provide no more than 30 units on the site. And then let's say there is also 10,000 square feet of commercial use that they would be able to provide no more than 20 on-site parking spaces as a maximum. So you would calculate separately for each of the uses, and that would then you would arrive at what your maximum would
But
be.
where would that parking be as far as, would you divide that on street parking? Or would there be behind the building or underground parking or first floor park? I mean, how would you work out that on that type of scenario? What do you think works best?
So that would be, so we're talking about maximum on-site parking here. And so, I think that it could be surface, like what you have behind Sorrel Place. It could be structured parking that is naturally ventilated, that is sometimes called podium parking, where it's partially submerged and then some of it is a little bit higher, is a little bit above ground. So you can sometimes see a little bit of it. And that's a lot less expensive to build than fully underground parking or parking structures. And I think in the short term, for the type of development we would be likely to see in Arcata within the Gateway area, that probably we're looking at a podium style parking with maybe also a little bit of surface parking as well. And then in the very long term, when the economic factors, conditions change, then sort of some more expensive forms of on-site parking with structured parking, underground parking, if sort of environmental conditions permit, might be possible in the long term.
But when you say podium, are you talking about second story parking where you drive up, or what is
No,
it?
I'm talking, it's parking where often it's partially submerged. So you drive down and then you'll have your first habitable level above that. It's maybe 5 to 10 feet above the sidewalk. Maybe what we'll do for future meetings when we're talking about parking, we could have a little photo or diagram that illustrates what we're talking about here so people can visualize it a little
We
bit
should
better.
let Jude jump in.
Yeah,
before the
okay.
time runs out. Thank you.
All right, you're welcome. Jude, you're next.
Hi, I don't know if you can see me. Can you? I can't
I can see
if
you.
you're seeing me.
I can
Okay.
see you.
I hope.
I can
I'm
also
in
hear
the
an echo.
frame. It's not showing me, but yeah, I just wanted to say that parking is a concern. It's a concern for me too. I mean, I live in Bayside in a single family home neighborhood, but I really like the idea of, moving to an apartment or even a condo overlooking the marsh at some point. But I think what a previous person said, a lot of people come to town and then leave town, and they're going to come in their car and leave in their car from places south, from places north. And I really have been wondering why there has not been talk about 2 or 3 level parking in the Gateway or anywhere else in town. I think that 2 or 3 level parking might be a solution. And it sounds like maybe you're saying it's too expensive to do that. Is that why it's not getting talked about more? So anyway, that's just my question. Thank you.
Yeah. So I guess to very quickly follow up on that question, parking structures are very, very expensive. 50,000 square feet or $50,000 per space. That's probably gone up given the cost of concrete these days. So I think that in the short term, that's not so much part of the vision just because of the extremely high cost of that. I think there's also a desire from the city's perspective to minimize the amount of parking that's provided so that more of the land resources can be used for housing as opposed to the storage of cars. And so this is a concept in the plan. I think it's part of the vision. And that's, I think, part of the reason you don't hear us talking about multi-level parking structures.
The thing is, it takes up less land. So you're wanting to use more of the land for housing, but making parking go up would preserve more land in that way.
Yeah, you have a valid point. Your point is well taken. Okay, so we have just a couple of minutes. We dwelt on this slide of number of spaces. There are other things. You know, if you're interested, I encourage you to do the survey. You can look at these standards in more detail. I guess in the couple of minutes that we have left, did anybody have anything else that they wanted to say about any of these other things? Bicycle, parking location, unbundled parking, anything else that you wanted to comment on?
I'd like to comment on the bicycle parking.
Okay, let's pull that up.
Are they covered, or are they just the rings that you chain up to? Because Humboldt County is a pretty wet place, and it's more encouraging to know if you can put your bike in a place that you're not going to come back and your seat's going to be soaking wet. Or so are they going to be? Are any of them going to be? And also, you know, a friend of mine, you know, we commuted together, and he'd ride his bike and leave it at the transit center, and it got vandalized. And so there is an issue of that, of bikes being vandalized. And so are there any concept of them being enclosed bike storage?
Yes, I think the short answer is yes, to a certain degree as a baseline requirement, and then with the option for developers to do even more as part of a community benefit. I see we're gonna lose our breakout room in 60 seconds. Fred, do you have another thing to say? Maybe some parting comments?
Just to reiterate that it needs to be enclosed, locking, or lockable bike storage. It just has to be. So, but we'll get to that later. Thanks very much.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Fred. So, so we're going to be kicked out of our breakout room in 30 seconds. And I guess I'll put another plug in for the survey, give you an opportunity to look at all of this in a little bit more detail, think about it, and provide some comments that myself and city staff can think about and contemplate before we do some more work and take materials to the Planning Commission for their work session.
Where do we go? I came in late, Ben.
I'll send a link. I'll put a link up.
You're doing great.
Okay, so the third and final topic for tonight is privately owned, publicly accessible open space. Thank you for sticking with us and working with us in this format. So open spaces is a big topic in the Gateway Plan. It's something that is really important, and the plan envisions a diversity of open spaces within the plan area, including plazas, pocket parks, linear parks along daylighted creeks, passive open space to provide for public gathering places and recreational opportunities. And part of that vision is this concept of privately owned, publicly accessible open space, which is essentially when a developer builds something, they create a plaza or a courtyard on private property that's accessible to the public. And the Gateway Plan calls for a series of privately owned, publicly accessible open spaces within the central gateway area, and for that these spaces to be linked together through various means, for these spaces to be visible, accessible, and activated, for there to be a variety of different types of spaces, and for them to be adequately maintained over time. And there is figure 7 within the Gateway Plan with a map that's a conceptual open space plan. And one of the things in this conceptual open space plan is an area where the plan envisions sort of new privately owned, publicly accessible open space to be primarily located. It's in the core area. It's this area that you can see that's highlighted red in the legend. It says private open space. And so the Gateway Plan standards refer back to this figure. So that's why I'm showing it to you. And so what we are thinking with this is that within that Gateway Area Plan figure 7 red area, that central area, a project that is participating in the community benefits program would have to do one of two things. So if the city is granting additional height, whether it's 5, 6 stories or more, the project would have to do one of two things if it's within that centrally located area. It would either have to provide publicly accessible open space at a certain amount, or it would have to pay an in lieu fee that the city would use to create publicly accessible open space in an alternative off-site location by pooling fees that have been collected from other sources. So if a project elected to provide the publicly accessible open space, the code will say how much it has to provide. And so what we're thinking is that, for a 5-story project, for example, there would be a certain amount, say 7.5% of the site area, which would, on a 30,000 square foot lot would be, kind of like, I don't know, a little less than 2,500 square feet, which is a decent sized little public plaza. But as a building got taller and the city was asking for more as a community benefit, the size of that publicly accessible open space or the fee that was being collected in lieu would need to be larger. So the taller the building got, the more the city would get out of it. So that's the big picture concept for that core area. I think some of these numbers might be massaged a little bit as we move through the process, but this is a good starting point for us. And then outside of that core area that I showed in the map, providing publicly accessible private open space would be optional for a project that's participating in the community benefit program. It could choose to do this as one of many other ways to satisfy the community benefit requirement to be eligible for that additional height. With the same idea, the taller you go, the greater the benefit needs to be in terms of the amount of open space prepared. So the Gateway Code is going to include standards in terms of the amount of open space required and when it's required. So we're interested in your thoughts on that. The Gateway Code is also going to include standards related to the design of these open spaces and the amenities within these open spaces. And I have a couple of images here that I'm going to use to illustrate what these proposed standards are right now, which we're going to ask for you to comment on in your breakout room. So there'll be minimum dimensions. What we're proposing is that there'll be a minimum average dimension of at least 30 feet in 2 opposing dimensions to have enough space. There'll be standards for accessibility and visibility, where the open space would have to be directly accessible and visible from the public right-of-way and at ground level or close to ground level. And also rules for the height of fences walls and hedges that are within and along the perimeter of these open spaces. Here is an image of the Paseo Nuevo in Santa Barbara, which some of you may have visited. It's a very lovely space, and it's illustrating how there are active uses with transparent windows that are fronting the open space. And so we're proposing a standard that at least 50% of the building frontages adjacent to the open space need to be composed of active uses with a certain amount of transparency, that these active uses need to be oriented towards the open space, and that sort of active uses such as outdoor dining are permitted to spill out into these open space, provided that there's seating and shading to provide for a comfortable space. Also rules about furniture and other elements. We don't want the space full of seating or other furniture. There needs to be a certain amount of, say, 40% of the open space that needs to remain sort of open and free fixed elements, as well as rules for lighting, because we want these open spaces to be sort of available for use during both the daytime and the nighttime, particularly during the winter hours. So here's another example space. This is in Concord in the San Francisco Bay Area. I think it's pretty successful from my perspective, and it's illustrating how this space is well connected with the adjacent sidewalk. It's open and fronts onto the street, and so there'll be standards related to that. Also standards related to the amount of fixed structures that are allowed along the perimeter of that open space adjacent to the sidewalk. I think what we're proposing is no more than 50% of the perimeter that's adjacent to the sidewalk can be occupied by a fixed structure. So these are a lot of details that are included in the proposed standards, but I think cumulatively these design details make a big difference in terms of the space being successful and available to be used by the public. And so if the city is allowing for increased height or allowing for this amenity to count towards the minimum benefits to allow for the increased height through the community benefit program, we really want to make sure that these spaces are well designed, and potentially they'll be approved through a ministerial process. So we need objective standards in place to make sure that they're well designed, because there wouldn't be a discretionary design review process with a public hearing to sort out the details of these spaces. So that's why we're going into this level of detail. So within your breakout room, you'll have an opportunity to look at some of these standards a little bit more specifically, we want to get your reaction to them tonight. I see David, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, just when you're done. Thank you.
Okay, right. And then, so we'll divide into the breakout room again, and then sort of come back for one final little wrap up, and then we will be on our way.
Yeah, I just wanted to say before we go into the breakout rooms, so that everyone can hear this at the same time, that I noticed as we were presenting these materials tonight that we have in the various tiers still listed an 8-story column. And I just want to remind folks that the Planning Commission is currently working on a recommendation that would limit building height to 7 stories maximum in the Barrel District. And so those different tiered categories currently would drop off that 8. So I didn't want anybody to get concerned that we were talking about 8-story buildings again.
Okay, thank you, David. All right, so Jen will work her magic and put you into the breakout room, and we'll have about 15-20 minutes for that, and then we'll sort of reconnect together here, and then we will wrap.
All right, welcome one and all. We have been assigning folks randomly, so I think we probably at this point, everyone has had the opportunity to be in each breakout room, but just in case, For those of you who don't know, I'm David Loya. I'm the Director of Community Development. Our first breakout room ran a little over in terms of everybody having the opportunity to speak. So in the last breakout room, I asked for first round comments to be limited to about 45 seconds. We'll do debate style, first blush, and then we'll go back through the group as there are more comments to make sure everybody has an opportunity to speak. So Lizzie, I see you have your hand up. Why don't you go ahead and kick us off? We've got some suggested topics here, but you can springboard anywhere you want to.
Hi. Yeah, I think that the sorry, it's Oreos. That having public accessible space is wonderful, and I think that all the best places that I've visited have a ton of publicly accessible space on the street. And yeah, I just love that, and appreciate that that's being considered.
Thank you. Cindy?
Yeah, that looked really, the designs looked really great. Since a lot of people are getting out of town designing these structures, probably large contractors or companies, I would like, if there's any way to say sunshine, sunshine, and more sunshine, that people don't understand how cold it can be in Humboldt County. And when I was trying to build our home, so many designs would put, the garage south facing. And so just, is there a way to say, hey, those are of you designing, these beautiful ideas that make sure we get the south facing for the city. And, I mentioned this for the, in the first breakout, that let them know that sunshine is a premium here, and people don't need shade covers. We need to have the sunshine.
Yes. Thank you for that. Yeah, I totally agree. And our form-based code can absolutely do that. Chris,
yeah,
go ahead.
Just a lot of people are out of the area and probably won't realize how cold it can be sitting in the shade in Humboldt County when it's foggy.
Yeah, got it.
So,
yeah, absolutely. Chris?
David, as far as the way the form-based code is going to work with the buildings that are 4 stories and less, are you still going to be requiring open space for those? I mean, is it going to be like the Sorrel building with that little playground in the back, or what? Where are you going to go with that? I think that the importance of this open space concept should come into play. And will the form-based codes require that on the lower buildings, or are you only going to require that as an amenity, or what's going on with this?
Yes. Yeah. So the base tier for 4-story buildings has no requirement for publicly accessible open space under this current version. So what I'm hearing you say, if I could make the logical jump, Chris, is that you'd like to see something starting at 4 stories.
Yeah, I would think with any form-based code, it should be representative of all, there should be something written in, not even with open space, but with all of the different things that you're doing on the lower buildings. And is the form-based code going to be completely alienated from the lower buildings, or is that going to be part of how it's drawn into that? Do you follow what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's slight. I do, yeah, I do, and a slightly larger question than just open space. I want to make sure we focus on open space and get to everybody. So we can get back to that. Jane, go ahead.
Sounds like you're giving them an option of either providing money for a public space or operating a privately owned public space, which they would then have to maintain, and the desirability of that for the community or for the government basically is that they don't have to maintain it, but the private company does.
Correct.
Can you set standards for maintenance then, if that's going to happen? And if you collect fees instead, where are you going to put the open spaces? And we already have the 11th Street pathway. And I think that needs to be considered as part of having public available space and should be developed as such. So I think that should be part of this whole discussion.
Thank you for that. Ron?
I like the overall concept, the private public, and the interlocking spaces and accessibility and visibility. So I just want to go on record as saying, yeah, it's good.
Okay. Thank you. Sherry?
So there were about 3 photographic examples given, and I noticed that they all involved surrounding buildings that were 3 stories or maybe 4 with a setback. And I think that to better inform this discussion, we should have had 7 stories, examples of 7-story buildings on each side with the publicly shared space in between. Because these are not representative of what we're discussing. And these are very pleasant spaces, but they're not like what's being proposed, which is some shared space next to a 7-story building. And we also should designate on what side of the street it should be on for solar shading issues.
Yes, yeah, that's come up a couple times. Thanks, Sherry. Fred?
Yes, thank you. Ben mentioned that it's only for what look like the red zone barrel to 10th Street, not including K Street. Is that the case? Second, you say that they're going to be linked together. How? I mean, but by the road itself or by other paths? Any clue when the, whatever you want to call it, the park or the plaza size space where wing inflatables would be built? I mean, could that be in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years? In terms of the in lieu fees, the question of how many dollars that would be. And to me, an in lieu fee defeats the entire purpose of having a park. If it's in an alternate location, then it is not for the people who live in the Gateway area. The illustrations, I'll make a point that it has to look like it's not private. The first illustration seemed like it was a private plaza for those buildings. The other ones look fine. In the picture of Paseo Nuevo in Santa Barbara, that's what I envisioned for L Street, for the L Street Linear Park, with small shops on the perimeters. There is a sign there which indicates that there can be loading traffic on that street, like a owner. So that was kind of interesting. And would all the open spaces be paved or brick? Would they be grass or playgrounds? That's it. Thanks.
Okay, that was a lot. Not sure I tracked all that, and I'm probably not going to be able to respond back to everything. But yeah, I think the the key points, the idea that the open spaces be linked, and some of those would be linked through trails. Some of them would be linked through sidewalks. But the idea being that they look and feel and operate as public spaces. We got through our first round. Are there folks who'd like to reflect back on something you heard? Are there other thoughts or ideas that you had that you wanted to make sure you could share, or other questions? Maria, I think you had your hand raised for a moment, but then you put it back down. Is there anyone who hasn't spoken yet that would like to speak? Okay. Okay, Chris, you're up.
Rebecca hasn't spoken. Why don't you let her go first? I'll follow up if you don't mind.
All right. Well, thanks for that, Chris. Rebecca, go ahead.
Thank you. I just have a question about the way that the square footage and the different stories dictate how much open space is required to be planned for, and how that would, if you can go to the graph, that would be helpful. I'm just curious if there's how this would work. I mean, we don't know what type of development is actually gonna happen, like what specific proposals. So I'm just wondering if there'd be anything written in that would make sure that there's some community open space, even if most developers end up developing 4-story, within an area where there's nothing required, like less than 30,000 square feet and 4-story buildings. If there would be some way to make sure that doesn't that doesn't result in very minimal.
No public open space. Yeah. I think that there's this is overlay on top of our existing recreation fee for new construction. And so there's basically 1% of the value of a building is already assessed to every project. So this would be above and on top of that. And I think to a point that was made earlier, how do you ensure that these dollars are spent in the area where, where they're needed, where these new people are coming? Certainly for, the in lieu fee, if one were requested and accepted, those would absolutely be spent in the area. It's a little trickier to get the recreation fee for new construction to be spent in a specific location. You can't cordon those dollars off, but there are multiple funding sources for parks, and so that's one thing, is that we would ensure that there are park facilities being built in that area. And then the other thing I wanted to reflect back on the streetscape design, there are, in almost every situation, there's going to be some public space created on private property. It gives us the setbacks that we'll need for that solar access that so many people have mentioned. And it's really the only way to do it with the size of our rights of way.
So,
Chris?
Sorry, can I just clarify something real quick? So
Sure.
Ensure that it's spent in that area through existing code, or would that be written into this form-based? What do you mean? Or do we just have your word? Like, I mean, that's serious. Like, what what do you mean you'll ensure it?
Yeah, no, that would be written into the in lieu program, that those funds be spent in that area.
Thank you.
Chris?
Yeah, just again, with me, always a little bit off track, but let's talk about the linear park as far as that main thoroughfare that would go through, that would add open space to that entire area. I mean, it would be an obvious advantage for developers if something like that was created while you're doing this. What's the thought that's been given by the staff with that possibility? I mean, what do you think of the advantage of that? Where are you guys with this?
Let me try and reiterate and make sure I understand. Are you referring to L Street?
Yeah, like the whole concept of the linear park, if that was to be created as a huge open space area that would go through this whole district, I mean, that would be an advantage for developers with what they're doing, an advantage for the public, et cetera. And I'm just curious, I don't know if you're willing to go on record and talk about where you guys are at with that concept in relationship to developers having to provide open space and all of that.
Okay, I'm trying to read between the lines a little bit here, Chris. Are you referring to the and we may need to cut and go to next person, but are you referring to L Street as a linear park as opposed to a driving road?
No, exactly. Yeah, that would be a creation of a park / open space area that would help delineate.
Yeah, so L Street is
responsibility for developers with what you're hoping they will provide for on these taller buildings.
Yeah, absolutely. So part of the concept with the the linear park is to expand the trail that's existing there, so that properties that are along L Street, one of the site-specific community benefits that we would look for, along L Street, is that as these properties redevelop, that they actually carve out a little bit more space so that trail becomes a little more spacious, or add park amenities, little exercise spaces, that sort of thing, to that space. And that's one way that those in lieu fees could be used if the property is being developed that isn't along L Street, or properties that are along L Street could actually contribute directly to that in that way. So, I think whether L Street is opened up for through traffic or not, I think that there is an interest, in the community of expanding, the footprint of that trail and making it more useful. Jane,
it sounds like just one more brief follow-up that advantage for the developers to pay money rather than give up a bit of space for their development project would be definitely enhanced if we could create that linear park. So anyway, thank you for talking about that. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead, Jane.
And I wanted to add the question of whether you have constructed a design for a linear park there, and how that would be constructed that would actually retain the amenities of the current linear park and add to them based on the 2010 design for a linear park there that was developed way back when. So I think it'd be terribly useful if you would actually undertake that design as an alternative to just being a one-way street going south parallel to K Street, and let us actually consider that. The Transportation Safety Board, the Transportation Committee has actually recommended that this be done, and I'd like to see us actually have a design so we could look and see what it would look like and make the specifications for the kinds of buildings we would like to encourage be designed there, whether it's opened up or not.
All right. Thanks.
Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you for that.
I agree with Jane.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, thanks, Sherry. Any other reflections folks are having, comments they want to make back about something you've heard or any of the designs that we've looked at? Go ahead, Fred.
Yes, a question about the map that's on the screen now, the conceptual open space plan with the red border. What does that mean, private open space? The only area in Gateway where there would be private open space, or the largest area? And then also, do you have any feeling at all for the timeline on developing the large plaza area in the Barrel District? Thanks.
Oh, right. Yeah, that was one of your questions previously. This is maybe mislabeled. I think we need to clarify this. This is publicly accessible private open space. So all projects within this boundary would be required to have publicly accessible private open space. Projects outside of that area could elect to through the benefits program, but these would be required to, as it's currently envisioned. This boundary could be modified. There's a lot of parcels here that are, probably higher potential for redevelopment. So it could be, encompass more area. The city council could say, look, we want to see private open space on every parcel, and then we eliminate that red line. So there's still some options out there, but that's the way it's currently envisioned. In terms of the timeline for development.
All right, you are with me again for this last group to talk about open space, and Zoom is doing very interesting things to me tonight. So thank you for bearing with me with my sharing. I will share this, and then I will open this, and then I will do this. Okay, that's the wrong presentation. And try one more thing. Okay. All right. So I think we have a couple of people with hands raised. I think we'll just jump right in. I think if I'm pronouncing this right, Raylina?
Yeah, thanks, Ben.
Okay.
Cool. Well, thanks. There's definitely a lot, but I'll be considerate of other people's time as well. So specifically with the open space required, I'm wondering if rather than looking at it as a community benefit, there's a stipulation in terms of funding going towards public art within these spaces. So, for instance, 2% of development costs go towards public art within these spaces, regardless of building height. There's some other questions I have, but I'll pass it off for now.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. That is certainly on our list. So Anthony, why don't you go next?
Thank you. I really do appreciate that y'all are taking some time to consider lighting as far as the new developments go, and I appreciate the ideas of having open space designated and different regulations about that. I just wanted to voice my support for the L Street Linear Park. And I think that's a really important aspect of this entire cell, as far as getting the city and everyone to support the Gateway area plan, is really considering the L Street Linear Park as opposed to the truck route. Thank you.
Right. Okay, Wendy, you're next.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment about not paving everything. And and the problem that will create with runoff, and that I know that Portland has some really innovative development rules about only allowing a certain percentage of a property to be covered in pavement or building, that there has to be, green infrastructure. And so I just wanted to throw that in there. I think that it will create a problem if everything, I mean, for accessibility and all that, the plazas are wonderful, but it can't all be covered up.
Second that strongly, exclamation part.
All right. I shall put an exclamation mark in my notes.
Is it all right to jump in, Ben? Or
I think James, you're next on my list. Is that you?
Perfect.
All right.
Yeah, I didn't want to go ahead, but yeah, thanks. And I do agree with everyone else. The fear is high that we could end up with just so much building massing and, and bonuses and, and ground floor coverage that we'd lose our open spaces. I think Anthony bringing up L Street, I know it's not the focal point, but there are a lot of open spaces that stand to be lost along that corridor if it is paved over the road. And then I do want to jump back to park and lieu fees. And do you have any idea at this point if that money would be dedicated back into the Gateway area, since it is an area that should have a focus for, parks and open spaces, or if that would be filtered out to other parts of the city?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm going to stop there, and hopefully we'll get another round. And
yeah, great. Well, thanks for that. And I haven't talked to the city about it, but when I've worked on projects like this in other places, there has always been sort of the desire and the commitment for fees collected within a specific area to be used only for projects within that area. So I think having clarity on that will be important. Let's see. So Patricia.
Yeah, I have a couple things that I wanted to, I'll just kind of do a checklist on what I wanted to add. Definitely want to, yes to Wendy of not over paving the area. I know there's a network of wetlands in that area, so it'd be nice to have an interconnective wetland and some type of wildlife corridor, if possible, to stay in there. And water runoff too is kind of a concern. Another thing is, it would be really nice on these presentations to have examples of 5, 6, 7 stories, possibly 8 stories of, so we just kind of know what we're looking at on height. And so future ones, yeah, it'd be nice to see kind of something that's corresponding with what's going to be brought into the Gateway. Another one is, I agree, in lieu fees should remain within the Gateway area as much as possible. And then I like the idea of doing courtyards that are accessible to the public, and having a variety of things that kind of link together. And of course, I'm going to put in my plug for the L Street Linear Park. I think courtyards could kind of face, like private courtyards could kind of face that public linear park along L Street and kind of make some really interesting pockets. So that's all I had to say. Thank you.
Great. Okay, let me see. So I'm not seeing any new hands up. So if Raylina, if you want to add more, I think we still have a little bit of time. In fact, we have, according to my schedule, we have 10 more minutes.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I'll third what Wendy said about, not paving everything. Not to get too specific, but I'm sure there will be encouragement to do native species and maybe even redwoods rather than tiny landscaping trees. They all have to be tiny in the beginning. What I wanted to bring up was stipulating that we don't use anti-homeless features within our community spaces. I understand the sentiment, but by and large, it's just uncomfortable for everyone. So if we're going to have a community space, the benches can seat people. I love how in the plaza we have benches that face one another. It's such a great way to facilitate conversation and community. So stipulating that we're taking an active measure against anti-homeless features within community spaces.
All right, got it. Okay, Anthony, do you have more that you wanted to share?
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to thank both Wendy and Relina for the comment about not paving over everything, and also the comment about not creating spaces that are made to deter homeless people from hanging out there, or anybody at a certain point. But I also wanted to bring up, because Wendy's comment reminded me, I was looking into this earlier. Arcade is so far away from thinking about this sort of thing, but some places have laws against how many people you're allowed to cram in a certain space. And I think that that's something to keep in mind, is that there are very good reasons for those laws as far as safety goes, comfort, and we've heard from the fire department that they can't protect over a certain amount of, a certain height. And I just want to bring up the San Luis Obispo has a 5-story maximum. And I think that space is a big part of that. The school wants to bring so many people here, but if they bring so many people here that it decreases our quality of life, that could be a problem. And so I just felt encouraged to bring that up when hearing the cement comment. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for sharing that. Let's see. So who's next? How about Wendy? You have something more to add?
I do. I just had a question. Publicly accessible can mean go in and sit, and then it can mean that the public can hold an event or collect signatures on a petition, or what are the rules in terms of what people can do in these spaces? How publicly accessible will that be?
Right. I think that it would that is a good question, and I will make a note to put together some accurate information on that. I'm a little bit reluctant to say anything that turns out to not be true, but that's an excellent question. I think it might depend on the nature of the space, I think I would do a little bit of research into how other communities that have a lot of these spaces, such as San Francisco and Oakland, what exactly their rules are. But that is a very good question, and I thank you for bringing that up, and we'll report back to you on that. Let's see, James.
Yeah, just a quick addition on this. I think my concern is that if we do rely completely on community benefits for open space, then at that point we fall back on whatever the minimum setback standards are on building massing, correct? And so if there's any hope for adjustments on that, that'll need to move forward with the Planning Commission in hopes of making adjustments possibly to the draft if it's insufficient as far as open spaces. If I've got it wrong, I apologize, but.
So, I think I understand what you're saying. So this open space requirement is really would be a separate thing from the setbacks. You have setbacks, which is always required in terms of the distance of buildings from property line. And this would be something that would be in addition, and typically would require buildings to be set back even further from the property line, at least for a portion of the lot, if that answers your question.
Yeah, and I guess to clarify it, mainly the open spaces we're talking about, I mean, I think it's great if it falls properly, but will be community benefits, and anything beyond that would require, I guess, I'm not sure if that's the policies or the codes at that point, as far as anything further would go in, as far as the open spaces. Anyway, hopefully I hope I didn't go too much in circles on that, but just to try to understand it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, just to sort of reiterate, this would be in addition to any minimum setback requirement, and it's space that would have to be publicly accessible and usable and designed consistent with the standards, and in many cases would necessitate, at least for a portion of the property frontage, a building setback further from what the minimum would
Yeah,
be.
so at least you get at these certain levels of square footage, you'll get these minimums as a requirement. So there is something there prior to actual community benefits.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. All right. Thanks. Sorry if I'm looking back at the table now, and it's anyway. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a lot to digest in one sitting. But I think we have a couple more minutes left. Patricia, did you have more that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to put a shout out, or I just wanted to kind of put in a need for covered areas in open spaces, since it does rain so much. And so like things for like music venues or picnicking or such like that, for shade or rain.
That is a good point. Jude, you have your hand up. I think maybe we haven't heard from you yet.
Hi. Well, you heard from me a few minutes ago.
Oh, okay.
I wanted to ask a bit about the linear park. When people say linear park, I assume they mean not having any cars driving on L Street. Is that correct? And make it all park? But I have to say that as an older person who may end up living in the Gateway area, I don't know if it'll happen fast enough for me to get there in time, but it's terrifying for me to cross K Street. And one of the reasons that I personally am excited about having one lane of traffic on K and one lane of traffic on L is that a slower moving person, including disabled people, would only have to cross one lane of traffic at a time. So I just want to put in a plug for that. That's where I go when I think about walking from Gateway to the plaza. That's my big concern. Also, I want to also pile on with the not paving everything. But if you have a lot of ground in these open spaces that is absorbing rain, et cetera, which is really great, please also consider people with canes, wheelchairs, et cetera, who do need a solid pathway to get across wide open spaces. So be sure to build that in, please. Thank you.
Okay. And that is perfect timing for what appears to be the imminent closing of our breakout room. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back into the full group. I'm going to give some information about the online survey. There'll be emails sent out about it as well to give you more opportunity to look at this material and provide additional comments. And then in the wrap up, we'll also sort of summarize some of the major themes that we heard. So thank you so much for being here. This is really great to hear, very interesting. And so what I was saying is that online survey, encourage you to take a look. It will contain all of the information you saw tonight. You will have an opportunity to look at it in a little more detail if you want to do that. and provide additional comments, which we very, very much appreciate. We'll send out an email to everybody. We'll put it on the city's website in terms of how to access the survey. We will make sure that everybody's response is collected and reported back. And the survey will close 5 p.m. On March 2nd. So you'll have a full week to do this. It's not too much material, so I think that's doable, and any additional comments that you're able to provide us will be very much appreciated as we work to further develop these concepts and take them to the Planning Commission for a work session that's scheduled for March 18th. And that's a Saturday. And so I wanted to say that to make sure I didn't forget, and to give everybody an opportunity to sort of go to this if they wanted to. But what I do want to do is spend a couple of minutes for the facilitators to maybe summarize some of the common themes that you heard in your breakout rooms. We'll also prepare a summary, a written summary of some of these themes that you'll be able to see. And but I did just want, everybody who wasn't in a particular group for discussion to hear what some of the other groups had to say. And maybe I'll go first and kind of report back what I heard. And I'm actually going to stop share so we can see each other's faces a little bit better. And I'm going to go backwards in terms of what I heard, first starting with the open space. I think one of the common themes that we heard is the desire to not overpave open spaces in the Gateway area, and making sure that we're thinking about maintaining the sort of existing natural environment as part of the open space network. And many people kind of emphasize that in their comments and repeated that. I think that with open space, that was probably the major common theme, and something that we heard from a lot of people, liking a diversity of spaces, considering the needs of persons with disabilities. A question about what are the rules for the public open space and what kind of activities can occur in these sorts of places. We had some people who couldn't resist but to provide comments on the L Street Linear Park, which were noted as well. And really thinking about sort of impervious surface and integrating with the wildlife corridors, public art as well, and how that could be integrated. So that's sort of some of the common themes about open space. And then moving on to the mobility and parking, we spent most of our time talking about the minimum and maximum parking requirements. In fact, I think that's pretty much all that we talked about. And I think we heard some comments, some concerns about establishing a maximum parking being something that a developer would not want to build, that a developer would decide not to produce housing within the Gateway area because they felt like they just needed to provide more parking than the maximum that was allowed. So that was one common theme that we heard. I think another common theme that we heard was some concern about increased on-street parking spilling over into neighbor and adjacent neighborhoods, resulting from new residents having cars but not parking them on site. That was another common theme that we heard, and a desire for the plan and the code to address that more. And then in terms of the streetscape standards, I think a common theme was a lot of interest and excitement behind this idea of creating a more generous public realm. to support a safe and active pedestrian space, but a concern about the devil being in the details in terms of exactly what those dimensions are, and is that going to work with the development that's allowed and existing constraints, and other practical considerations such as fire access, and other things like that. And then also the fact that there is concern among some in the community about the plan. And if we're also saying that, oh, by the way, you're also going to have to give up 15 feet of your property frontage to accommodate wider sidewalks, maybe that could be seen as further creating concern within the community about the plan. So those were some of the themes that we heard, and really appreciate it, the sort of range and sort of thoughtful comments that we received. So maybe I hand it over to David. I think maybe you were the other facilitator, and you can kind of report back on some of the common themes you heard in your room for those who weren't in your room.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Ben. And it was good to hear the themes that came out of your group. We kind of did a random, assortment into these breakout rooms, and so, there was a little bit of mixing, and so we heard similar themes. So I'm really going to just focus on the things that we heard in our room that maybe you haven't covered already, just for brevity. But we did hear a lot of those same themes that you just discussed. I'll go backwards from where you went. I'll start with the streetscape. The streetscape, is it's making me feel like we should pay a lot more attention to the streetscape and focus more energy on it, because the first couple comments that came out were nothing but positive, all for it, like it. So everybody is really jazzed about streetscape, and I want to spend more time where people are jazzed. There were some concerns though too, the devil in the details that came up in our group, but there were also concerns that, there was a question about whether these are standards or is this part of the public benefit program? And so we clarified that those are standards. But the streetscape was, pretty active conversation, mostly positive. I think people are really interested in seeing that come out and recognizing it'll be, challenging to actually do, especially when you have multiple owners on a block. For parking, our group went really all over the place. Didn't spend a whole lot of time on the standards as your group did, but a lot of questions came up about the equity associated with unbundling the parking and requiring payment for parking. And that came out in a couple of different ways. And there were some ideas for how to resolve some of those equity issues, including trying to find ways to limit the total amount that could be charged for unbundled parking. There was a lot of talk about EV charging and why don't we have a requirement that all parking spaces be EV ready or EV chargers, with this thought in mind that, eventually all cars are going to be EVs and you won't have gas engines anymore. There were a lot of ideas around setting a I'm sorry, I covered that. Requiring indoor bike storage, and some questions around how these alternative modes were going to work. But in general, people did appreciate the what was presented in this section, and were fairly positive about it. We were able to clear up a couple of points of confusion in what was presented, and that broadly covers it. When we got to the open space, again, people were really appreciative of this concept of, requiring public open space. There were a lot of questions about how it would work in practice, some clarification on, what Figure 7 means, how the red outlined area in Figure 7 would work, when these properties would be, or when the open space would be developed, and those kinds of questions. There was a lot of talk, this came up multiple times, about making sure that these spaces are a appropriately located on a parcel, in terms of solar access, recognizing that, we're not in Santa Barbara and it gets cold in the shade here. There were questions about whether there would be maintenance standards for these publicly accessible open spaces and how we would ensure that these spaces stay, as appropriate spaces for the public to be able to visit. There was some appreciation for, making sure that these were visible and connected to, the rights of way and obvious, publicly accessible spaces. And then there was a critique of the way that we presented the material, noting that none of the buildings that we showed in these graphics reflected 7-story buildings, and how those spaces would be designed if you did have, much larger buildings. So I think that covers the broad range. Obviously, there were a lot more detailed and nitty-gritty ideas that came out of those, but that kind of spans the big picture themes that I wrote down. And of course, we are going to have these, we recorded the breakout rooms, so that's going to be beneficial as well.
Great. Okay. So thank you for that, David. And just a reminder in terms of next steps, we have the online survey. We'll be sending out links to that. Definitely encourage you to provide additional comments, look at the materials more. That's going to close 5 p.m. March 2nd. So really looking forward to seeing additional comments there. And then after that, Saturday, March 18th in the morning, there will be a planning commission work session where we're going to do some more work based on what we've heard, bring some more detailed materials to the planning commission and give them an opportunity to provide us with their feedback. So, David, I do see that Jane has a hand up. Do you want to take any questions?
Jane, did you just have a clarifying question?
Yeah, that's all it is. I wanted to know when those recordings would be available of the closed session, the breakout rooms, and where.
I guess I will say sometime in the next couple of weeks, and they'll be on our SERP outreach page.
Because they serve as helpful reminders.
Yeah, I think, Ben, can you talk? I think you were proposing to do a little bit of post-production. Is that correct?
Yeah, we'll definitely need to sort that out, but we can provide links to those if that's something that's desired.
Okay.
Maybe in the
Right.
interim, providing just a reference video, unedited or just so it's available as a reference for notes before the survey is due.
Okay, we'll consider that, and we'll try and get up as quickly as possible. We'll send out notification that it's up on the website through our e-notification. So if you're not signed up for e-notifications, please sign up for that. Fred, did you have a clarifying question as well?
Well, a very strong recommendation that this be put up immediately, even tomorrow. It needs to be referenced, and send out an e-notification that there will be a survey. The last one, there wasn't an e-notification until just a couple days, 3 days before the survey closed. The notification for this had said nothing about the survey. None of the press releases said anything about a survey. So we have 1 week to get the survey out. The notification should go out tomorrow. And even if you can send or make available access to this just for the people who are on here for reference, it doesn't have to be finished. We can acknowledge that it's a rough, unedited form, but we aren't allowed to record it. So you should supply it. Thanks.
Gotcha.
Yeah, Jennifer, are you able to
thank you for that, Fred.
just take all of the participants?
I'll tell you what. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm going to interrupt real quick here. We're going to get the material up as soon as we can. We will send out e-notification when it's up, and I will take these suggestions into consideration. We're not going to commit to anything right here in the meeting, but we will attempt to address the concerns that you've raised. I think those are really good points.
Yes. And so I'll echo that, and also thank you for taking the time to be with us tonight. I know that we ask a lot of you in terms of your participation, and but it is very important and very valuable, and definitely very much appreciated. So thank you. Look forward to hearing your additional thoughts in the online survey and seeing you at future events. So I think with that, we will adjourn and enjoy the rest of your evening, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks all.
you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.